Hello.
Oh,
Hi. Welcome. Hi, if you're watching, joining us in the chat. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour, brought to you by Effective Artistry. Hello.
oh.
I'm trying to get myself all buzzed and get my energy up. So bear with me. Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I'm here to introduce you to Brandon Tessers and Caitlin Miller, therapists with Effective Artistry, which is a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook in the state of Illinois. Hello, Brandon. Hello, Caitlin.
Hello, Marie. Good to see you.
And good to see you too. I feel a bit like a kids' TV presenter, so I'm going to bring it down a notch.
I like it.
Hello.
I kind of love it.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you both. How are you doing this week?
Doing good.
Good. I'm gonna move this plant.
If you're joining us in the chat, feel free to join in the conversation, ask us questions, leave comments. I'll read out any questions you have for Brandon or Caitlin. Just to give you an idea, if you're joining us for the first time, This Is Not Therapy Hour is a chance to have a conversation with Brandon and Caitlin. It's not therapy, as the title suggests, but it is an opportunity for you to ask questions on anything related to neurodiversity, mental health, therapy, and coaching, which is, I guess, a related practice that some of us do as well with Effective Artistry. So if you've got questions, pop them in the chat and we'll ask them. Just bear in mind that anything you put in the chat will be put in under your username, whether you're joining us on Twitch, Facebook, or YouTube. So your comments will be publicly viewable. So do bear that in mind when you're adding a comment to the chat. And thank you for being here if you're here. So I think that's everything.
Yeah.
A little bit of housekeeping done. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. How are you? How are you both?
I was able to go on vacation, which was very nice. So
Ooh.
there's a refreshing aspect to it.
Are you comfortable sharing where you've been, what you've seen, what you've
Sure.
done?
I went to Vieques, which is the main island off of Puerto Rico, and yeah.
For some reason, I had it in my head of Puerto Rico.
Oh no, not that. Yeah, no.
Cool.
So pretty. Oh my gosh. Oh, I could go on and on and on.
And then you came back to the Chicagoland area where it's nice, but still winter.
Yeah, but I also have a refreshed appreciation of Northbrook. I was like, this is a very easy place to live. Just like,
Oh, yes.
yeah.
Convenient.
But low cost in the Brandon way of talking about cost.
Like attention, energy.
Yeah.
An easy place to live.
Yeah, and then like happy about where my life is mostly, which was nice too, and like being more clear on how I would like it to go. And let's just be honest, there were a lot of moments on the vacation where I was like, oh yeah, Brandon was right about that.
Yeah.
And then like I'd have a realization, I'm like, oh, Brandon's been telling me that for 6 months. And like, oh yeah, like it was funny. It's almost like the things like the people care about you, and this wasn't just Brandon, it was other people too, like giving me like feedback, and I'm like, oh, that was pretty much all right.
I have that experience too where like I'll be working through something, like some problem, and you know how I do. I use my own language and come up with my own stuff, and then I'll like come to some conclusion, be like, oh yes, and feel like so brilliant for devising this thing, and then be like, oh, that's probably what people have been meaning all this time when they said such and such. Like it didn't
That
make
was
sense,
really
but now that I've
similar.
worked through it.
Yeah, it's like the language I used was usually 50% my own and 50% what I could recall of others, including you. And I was like, oh, this is like talking to myself in a way that actually encodes in my long-term memory.
I find for me, and I think this is true for a lot of like neurodivergent people and whatever, that a lot of that stuff tends to be like there's a lot of stuff that people offer you as advice that you just kind of dismiss out of hand, or even if it's not dismissed, it's like you don't really take it seriously. It's worth exploring, whatever. And for me, and it seems like this is true for many neurodivergent people, that stuff especially would tend to fall under the category of like physical stuff. You know, like people who being like, oh, I started doing yoga and it's amazing, or whatever, or like, oh, I started eating or drinking this thing, or and I'll just, that goes in one ear, not the other. And then I'll explore stuff and be like, oh yeah, I should really look. Oh, that's what yoga is. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You know?
Or like, oh, maybe I've gone from 15 grams of protein a day to 80 grams.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you probably need like 100.
I don't know.
So many.
I've been meaning to work with a dietitian for years now, and I just keep not doing
I'm
it.
guessing it's 100, which is a lot. Congratulations.
Well, I weigh 230 pounds, so
Yeah.
it's probably a lot. Anyway, how are you, Marie?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm thinking a lot about physical stuff as well and health stuff, but I often am. Yeah, I'm doing okay, thanks. Still thinking about last week's conversation we had on clutter and decluttering. It was really useful because we could kind of use me as the client last week, which was fun.
Yeah.
I posed a problem and we talked through it, and I realized I was asking the wrong question. So we went back to the beginning and figured out what the right question to ask was. And now, yeah, I'm much more relaxed about the idea of moving house.
Oh, well, that's cool. That's good to know.
Yeah.
I'm
So
glad.
thanks. So if you're here in the chat, ask questions. We might be able to help you with the answers.
Helps so much.
So what's been on your minds, apart from, I guess, getting to get away and reflect?
I was just thinking about snorkeling and seeing a turtle come up for air, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is what being in the moment is. It was so pleasurable. I was like, oh my gosh. Oh.
Like paying attention to what's actually happening around
and
you.
Being almost completely out of cognition. Like I was so close to like analyzing it, and then I didn't, and it was incredible. It's just amazing. So that was like Brandon's right thing. Yeah.
When you say out of cognition, what do you mean?
What do you mean out of cognition?
Actually,
Brandon?
I was interested in the same thing.
I guess I think this is me paraphrasing Brandon, but that there is a continuum between cognition and environment, and that I disproportionately use a ton of my finite intellectual effort in cognition, and that can sometimes be advantageous, but often causes problems. And so one of the things I was practicing on the island is being in the environment and being less in cognition. And I was using the example of the turtle as being in the environment.
As a moment that you were paying attention to the environment?
I think of it as a spectrum. Like it was a moment where I feel as though I was almost 100% in the environment or paying attention to the environment.
Yeah. You know what's funny is, well, okay, I like that. And just to clarify, what we're talking about is attention. Mm-hmm. That like cognition theoretically is running all the time. You know, like it's like the engine in your car or whatever, when you're driving, the engine is running even if you're not paying attention.
So then would it be my attention is towards things that are not observable?
Right. So there's the language I use is there's the physical environment and there's the cognitive environment. Mm-hmm. And you can pay attention to either or both. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to be, you're paying 100% attention to the physical environment and 0 to the cognitive environment, which doesn't mean nothing's happening in there. It just means that you're not noticing what's happening in there, or vice versa. You can, that generally we would call like being in the zone or peak experience or being in a flow state or whatever. And then you can be so much paying attention, like completely paying attention to what's in the cognitive environment to the extent that you are not noticing anything in the physical environment, which generally when that happens, we would call that a flashback, although daydreaming and other things are versions of that too, where you just kind of lose track of what's actually happening.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is that anytime that a person thinks, wow, I'm really paying attention to the moment right now, noticing that is paying attention to the cognitive environment.
So I noticed it after the fact.
Yeah, well, and this is one of the if this isn't a bad thing or a good thing, it's just how it works, right? That one of the reasons that it's so hard for us to remember happy experiences compared to unhappy ones
Mhm.
is because a lot of the time when you're really happy, you're not paying attention to the fact that you're happy.
Mhm.
It's only later or after the fact or at any moment when you're like, wow, I am really happy. Sometimes you'll then be like, wait, focus in on the moment again. I shouldn't be thinking about how I'm feeling,
Mhm.
It's like that moment on vacation for everyone who's, I don't want to assume everyone gets to go on vacation, I guess, but for those who do and have gone on vacations, it's those moments where you're really enjoying yourself and then you become aware of the fact that you're really enjoying yourself. And sometimes that's accompanied with like, and it's not going to last much long. Like that's when you think about how much time you've got left on the vacation. So yeah, we don't tend to notice that stuff as much. So I'm glad that you did.
I was also thinking about the relativity of beauty and then how that can intersect with new experiences and attention. I don't know if that's too vague.
Yeah, I don't really know what you mean, but
Like I do think if a survey was done and someone like 100 people compared Northbrook to the island, I think most people would say the island is more beautiful. But I was thinking, is part of the beauty I'm experiencing on the island from the fact that most of it is novel? And are there ways for me to adjust the way I pay attention to the environment in my day-to-day life that would acknowledge the type of beauty that brings me pleasure that technically probably exists much more than I notice it because it's not novel?
so you're using beauty in this case to mean something which brings me pleasure to observe?
Pleasurable visual stimuli?
Oh, visual specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of that I think is kind of about the way that we use language, right? Like when people from our culture are talking about a beautiful place, mostly we're talking about like weather and nature, not usually as much like architecture and stuff. Although that will sometimes come in.
Yeah, and the island is very much just nature. Like there's not a ton of other things.
Fairly universally, people will say just by using this language that like a beach is a beautiful place to be and a mud pit is a ugly place to be kind of thing.
There were also moments though of like the architecture there is usually much more colorful. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's why I kept landing on like novel.
Well, I do think novelty is underutilized as like a people don't pay as much attention to it as a factor as I think it's useful to, because there does tend to be this thing of like something being interesting or enjoyable because it's novel somehow means that it's not actually interesting and enjoyable. Like what am I trying to think? Like, okay, an example that comes up a lot is people will like design a new organizational system for themselves, a new calendar or a way of tracking tasks or whatever. And they'll pour a lot of work into it and they'll pay a lot of attention to it and it will serve at least some of the purpose it's intended to serve for some amount of time. And then it stops working. And then they walk away from that saying, oh, that doesn't work for me. It only worked because it was novel. Like because it was new, that's why I was paying attention to it. It doesn't really work. But novelty is one of the like few things that we can point at as a universal guide for attention. Like universally, all humans will prioritize paying attention to something novel over something familiar. And we should use that. What's wrong with developing a novel organizational system and then once it gets old and you stop paying attention to it, developing a new one? We talk about that like it's failure, like shuffling through a bunch of things, but like
maybe it's just fun.
Yeah, I mean,
and it helps.
There are ways that like there are reasons that we operate in certain ways, and yes, novelty like we have terms like cabin fever or going stir crazy or whatever when you're in
Yeah.
the same physical environment for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And again, fairly universally, if you are in one physical environment for a long period of time, you don't like it. Like even if it's very comfortable, you get antsy, you want to go other places, do other things, you start to ruminate and get in your head a lot more because there's not as much calling your attention in the environment. But yeah,
We
no.
saw that during the lockdown period of the pandemic,
Yeah.
where a lot of people were confined to their homes, and like for me, I couldn't get on a flight. I couldn't go see family. So my vacation was sometimes I would move into the spare room so that I would be waking up in a slightly altered environment in the morning. But that actually did help me.
Yeah.
Just change up my living environment for a couple of days to help break the monotony of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all tend to live lives that are very focused on what we're thinking and feeling more so than what we're doing per se. So when we're looking for novelty and changing it up and that kind of stuff, we tend to think about like changing up our routines or like trying something different or learning something new, which are all good and helpful and important things. But we tend not to think as much about like literally going to a different physical space, being in a different physical environment, whatever. Yeah, changing that stuff can be helpful for sure. I don't know.
I move the furniture around a lot, and I'm starting to understand why now.
Yeah, and honestly, related to what we were talking about last week with the like decluttering and keeping places clean and whatever. Part of what I think is so satisfying to people sometimes to clean up a space is that when you start to like get an image of a space as being dirty or cluttered or whatever, and then can change it, it's kind of like rearranging the furniture. It's like, I've changed this to a new space. It can be very cathartic if you engage with it that way. This is another one of those things where it's like, if you think of it as a task that you're supposed to do, and that if you haven't done it, you're failing, it turns into this miserable and difficult things. But if you think of it as, something that is, I'm exerting influence over my environment, I'm making changes, like it can be very enjoyable.
Yeah.
It really, once you conceptualize something as like a chore, meaning once you start to think of something as if you don't do it, you're bad, and if you do it, your baseline, like you don't feel good for doing it, it's just you don't feel bad for not doing it. That means that you can really only feel bad or nothing about that thing. Yeah. That's a lot of what we're doing in therapy, a lot of what we do in this stream, a lot of what I'm doing with language is taking things and presenting them in a way that now makes them novel again, so that people pay attention to them again. So many things that we just get used to, and we start to ignore. You ignore what you're used to. One I like to point out to people, just as a way to like draw their attention to something. Thinking is weird. It's so weird that we do that. It's so weird that we just can like think about things, but nobody tends to really think about that because you've been thinking your whole life. But once you point out, like, for one way to like point this out and make it interesting and novel to people again is say, where are your thoughts? Where are they? They don't exist in physical reality. And people will say, well, there's like, electrical impulses in my brain. Yes, there are. Those aren't the thoughts though. They might correlate with or represent or be the mechanism behind, but we can see electrical impulses in your brain. We have tools to be able to do that. We can't see like whatever the thought is that you're experiencing.
Yeah.
They just literally don't exist in this physical universe, not in your body or anywhere. And you say something like that in that way, apply different language, and then all of a sudden people will remember how weird it is, and they'll start noticing their thinking a lot more.
Yes.
I think aspects of that applied to me because on my vacation I had almost like zero what I would call anxiety. And then I came back to my life and I was like, wow, I knew that these were many thoughts. I knew they happened in rapid succession. I knew they did not have much utility. I knew they were unhelpful. But like the rush of them coming back was like, wow. And I think that's a big thing with clients too, like to actually experience even just a day of having some of that lifted. I think it's just in some ways like thousands of times more helpful than just talking about like, well, this is what it could theoretically feel like if it was lifted, and this is what it does, and this is the utility, and this is how it relates to your neurodiversity, and well, this is the trauma lens from it, and like
I like that.
what are your unfiltered comments, Brandon?
What I was thinking was there's a word that I'm not gonna say I don't allow, but like distraction. The concept of distraction is a huge part of the problem that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about how depression and anxiety are both self-reinforcing for many reasons, but one of the mechanisms of that is that when you're very depressed or you're very anxious, it's more likely that you're going to spend more of your time in the same physical environment for various reasons, which gives more of your resources available to continuing to think about how you're doing and whatever. And that what you're talking about having that lifted is like, if we, for whatever reason, had to change, and that, you know, like if you're depressed and kind of in your house feeling stuck and not getting it, you know, not able to change things up, and then for some reason something happens and you have a day where it is different and you have to be out and about and doing things, even if that's not necessarily enjoyable, you are likely to not be ruminating as much as you are when you're in your home, because you're having to pay attention to whatever it is. And this is like why I hate people using the term distraction generally, but specifically here when they're talking about it as a solution to their problems. Meaning like, yeah, I've been really depressed. Oh, is there any time where you're not depressed? Yeah, well, like I distract myself. I'll do this or I'll do that, but that's just a distraction. As though that's not solving the problem. But when the problem is what you're thinking about and how you're feeling, and you do something that changes what you're thinking about and how you're feeling, that's a solution.
I'm curious, Brandon, did I use the word distraction?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so it's more of like a...
I was just connecting it to like, this is one of the reasons that I think it's really problematic for people to treat the concept of distraction as like a valid concept.
Yeah, well, and sometimes when I'm starting off with like clients who identify as having ADHD, I'll say things like, what do you enjoy most? Well, I enjoy these 5 things, but they're all distractions. And just like their face just like shuts down. Yeah. They're just a distraction.
And for anybody else, they might just be hobbies, but we call them distractions because we feel like, well, we shouldn't be doing them.
Yeah. If you call something a distraction, what you mean is it's not the thing I'm supposed to be paying attention to or engaged with. I'm supposed to be paying attention to something else or engaged with something else. And there's generally 2 different ways that gets used. One is when you have identified what is the thing you're supposed to be paying attention to. You know, like I'm supposed to be working on my homework, but I'm getting distracted by this other thing. And the other category is when you don't have an identified thing you're supposed to be paying attention to. And that's like what we're talking about is when you're like, oh yeah, I enjoy doing this thing, but it's just a distraction. And if I said a distraction from what, it's like, I don't know, it's just not important. It's not what I should be paying. I don't know what I should be, but it's not.
And a lot of that goes when I ask more questions into some version of like, I'm supposed to work 9 to 5. I'm supposed to exercise every day. I'm supposed to clean my house and keep it perfectly. I'm supposed to be dating. I'm supposed to be happy. I'm supposed to have 3 meals a day. I'm supposed to get 8 hours of sleep. And I just never do it. And I'm just distracted by my love of, I don't know, Taylor Swift.
That all sounds exhausting, though. When you put I'm supposed to in front of it, I immediately want to nope out of all of that and go lie down somewhere.
And listen to Taylor Swift if you like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's a fun, you know, taking something that people don't pay attention to and making it novel to pay attention to it thing. supposed to, what that means. Supposed to. The word suppose, we use that word in other contexts. I suppose, or do you suppose? It just means think. Suppose means think. So something that you're supposed to do means something that you think you should do, or that other people think you should do, which doesn't make it invalid, but just make it what it is. It's about you and or other people thinking it would be good for you to do the thing, not any actual quality about the thing itself. It's one of those words like necessary and whatever. It's one of those words that describes the way that a person is thinking of or relating to something, that people then start to treat it as though it's describing the thing itself, when it's actually describing the way a person is viewing the thing.
Can you give an example of that? Necessary?
Like, yeah, if I say I need to go to the grocery store, like going to the grocery store is necessary. It just means it's what I think of it as being. It's not actually intrinsic to. Necessary is a tricky one because people will think that necessary has an official definition of necessary in order to live. Like, if
that's
someone
where
says,
I was gonna go.
but that's not what necessary means either. Necessary is a relationship word. It relates A to B, right? That in order to accomplish B, A is necessary, means that if not A, then not B. It doesn't mean anything in and of itself, including, it doesn't even really mean originally, it doesn't even really mean if not A, then you die. That's just like the same way that in English there's what's called the understood you when you make a, it technically would be a sentence fragment grammatically if I were to say sit down, because there's no subject there. But there's the understood you, where if I am giving a command to someone, the subject of that is you.
Is the implied either you need to sit down or you should sit down? Is that where we get to should or need?
No, I'm just using that as an example of an understood thing that isn't said.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I feel like the common cultural connotations of that now are should and need, and that need becomes like a I'm gonna die, and should becomes I'm gonna be a bad person.
Yes, the understood, if I say A is necessary without identifying in order to be, then the understood in order to be is or I will die. Which is why if someone says, I need to do this thing, and if you're like, do you really need to? They'll say, well, no, I'm not going to die if I don't do it, but because people think that's what necessary means, is that you'll die. Which, interestingly, I think is a major part of how people end up becoming anxious and panicky about pretty much everything. Because of how language works, how the brain works, whatever you want to say. If I identify that the word need, necessary, necessity, if that means or I will die, if not X, then I will die. And then I start saying, I need to do this, I need that, this is necessary, then the connections are made and my body starts responding to the thing, including my nervous system, the brain and the rest of the nervous system, starts responding to that thing as though I will die. If I say I need to do my homework, because to me need means or you will die. If I say I need to do my homework, then I will start to respond to doing my homework as though it is life or death. Because another one of those things people are just used to that you shouldn't be used to, it's weird, is anxiety, prefrontal cortex shutdown, panic, all these different, we're talking about different intensities of the same experience. But that's the thing that the body does when it's about to die. Like fight or flight is a thing that happens to prevent you from dying. It's a break glass in case of emergency thing. And we all go into fight or flight like every day, multiple times a day, constantly. Part of what I was saying before about like we tend to focus on what we're thinking and what we're feeling more than the observable reality and whatever. Is that including like I don't like how people use words like harm and safety to relate to how people are thinking and feeling. Not that those words are being used to describe important things, but those aren't great words to use. There's a difference between I'm feeling unsafe and I am unsafe. A lot of the time, both of those things are happening at the same time, but they don't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
And with some of the language that we're using, yes, we are putting ourselves into a place where it's like, oh no, if I'm sad or if I'm tired, that means something's wrong. Something terribly bad is happening. What's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to just being sad or being tired because of whatever's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to a podcast by John Ronson recently, and he had one episode where he spoke to Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
About, I can't remember the phrase they use, like something like terminology creep or something like that, because Bessel van der Kolk focuses on trauma, and I think initially started working on PTSD, as it was originally thought of as being in, something that presented in people who were coming back from war and conflict and things like that. And I think he has some concern about the way the word trauma is being used more broadly now, and how it might be kind of self-reinforcing. I don't know. I found it interesting that, I guess there's a question of whether we're gatekeeping terms like trauma and things like that, if we're saying, no, you can't use it for this or you can't use it for that. But just thinking about how certain words being used in certain contexts can maybe do us a disservice. I'm not going to say harm. I'm not going to say harm.
What?
So I wonder what you think about that.
I have so many thoughts. You start, Brandon.
Oh, please.
One of the thoughts I was thinking is there's a person that I know who received a letter from another person who is a therapist. And that therapist used a ton of clinical language. And so essentially it was a series of insults, but it was cloaked in clinical psychological terms. So it's like, oh, well, this person is using this word and this word and this word, which means their observations are right because they understand the depth of human complexity. And then, so using words like that, which does happen colloquially a lot, especially on social media and stuff, but I feel like it turns into like a wall where it's like, I'm saying this thing, you better know what I mean, you're dumb if you don't know what I mean, and I'm also right. And so then when you ask people to clarify, they're like, oh, well, I mean, what you said hurt my feelings, but actually it was this. And I'm not even going to use these, all these psychological things. And sometimes when I hear these things, I actually just laugh. I don't know. Do you want to?
No, this is part of why I push so hard against the idea that psychology is what people think that it is, and et cetera, because that particular example you're talking about, the way that people think of psychological language incentivizes all kinds of problematic things.
And just to add a little bit more detail, in the letter, it included a psychological term, and then later in that paragraph it said, and if you're wondering what this means, you can look it up and do your own research, as though the observation is so valid and so true, because there's clearly one truth. There's one truth that this person needs to do their own research.
I don't even need to spend the time to explain this to you.
Yeah, and sometimes I actually think it can be 1,000 times more powerful to say you said this thing and it made me so sad I actually burst into tears instead of you said this thing, so therefore my anxiety got triggered from my PTSD because when this happened when I was 5 was this really awful thing, and you used the same word and your body language reminded me of that person. So it's not your fault at all and you don't have to make any changes, but it just really hurt me because of my anxiety and depression.
This is a lot of what I'm talking about when I talk about people needing to intellectually justify their experience.
So many things.
It's so much better and easier to just say what your experience is.
That was part of my island realizations that were technically Brandon. I was like, he's right about this too.
If somebody pushes back or has questions, then you can work on exploring other answers. But instead of, if you're preemptively doing that, you're just doing it all the time. And so yes, treating psychology like it is the explanation for why, like you can explain why somebody does something. You cannot, psychology or any other way, you can't explain why a person does a thing. You can identify some factors that you think are relevant and even with very high level of confidence. But even if you do that, you can't, that's not an explanation of, there's a million other things going on.
I like to think of like in my own brain that why is like a piece of art. Like when you ask the question why, your answer is like abstract art instead of your answer is like reading a religious
people think
text
that it can be
of
correct.
Yeah.
That you can correctly identify why someone does or thinks or feels. And then they, so that's one of the things that incentivizes that I think is problematic is that people get really good at talking about why they think they or somebody else is thinking or feeling or doing whatever they are. And then don't pay as much attention to like the impact of it. You know, everyone's arguing where you started with, like linguistically, right? There's a lot of this arguing over what words should be used in what way, what's the correct or incorrect usage. In the neurodiversity community, it happens a lot, like the debate over ADHD, for example. Here's the thing. What you think of something and what actually exists in reality are two separate things. So
they literally always are. Like
yes.
Always.
Yes.
Because I think some people would say, well, Brandon, this is a chair.
In which case, your thought is a theoretically accurate or useful representation, symbolic representation of the thing. It is not the thing. The phrase that gets used for this a lot is the map is not the territory.
I thought of that too on VIK.
Yeah, cool. A map of the United States is not the same as the United States. It wouldn't be useful if it was. The point is that it is an abstract and simplified representation that identifies some things that make it useful that the actual terrain itself isn't useful with, right? Anyway, the only field I know of that deals with the reality of language is linguistics. And I don't know why people seem to not pay attention to linguistics as a field generally. Like, think about in pop culture or just like random conversation, whatever, like how much your average person talks about psychology versus how much they talk about linguistics.
Would linguistics include, what is the word? Epidemiology? What's the word?
Epistemology?
Is that different?
Etymology.
Does that that's part of linguistics, right? Or no?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's like history and linguistics.
So can you tell me, I am curious what you mean by linguistics.
Linguistics is the study of language, not like learning a particular language or whatever. It's just the study of language.
So would it be more of like the way people use language in a particular language, or does it include also definitions and like history of like root words, and this is when it was used, and this is where it came from, and this was the initial definition?
Yeah, the part's etymology, and that would fall under it, sure. But
because I feel like you're talking about another part of linguistics.
Well, I just brought it up so that I could reference what linguists will say, and importantly, here is the definition of correct versus incorrect usage of language from linguistics. If a native speaker does it, it is correct. And that's not to like separate people into different classes or whatever. The point is, when we're saying that you can make a mistake with language, by definition, the only way to be able to say that you're making a mistake is when it's a language you don't speak and you're trying to learn it and you do something differently than the way that the people who already speak it do it. That's by definition what we would say is incorrect. So if a native speaker does it, so any argument over incorrect or correct usage of language, if it's using that phrasing, like whether the word is being used correctly or not, it's just power. It's just people trying to exert power and control. Now, obviously, as someone who has a lot of opinions about what language is most beneficial to use in which ways and whatever, I think that there are a lot of ramifications about how we use language. But I'm never, ever talking about correct or incorrect. you'll note that even when I talk about like dictionary definitions and whatever, I'll say things like the technical definition or the dictionary definition or the official definition, not the correct definition.
Mm-hmm.
Again, in linguistics, there are, I don't even know how many, but there are many, many different types of definitions, and dictionary definitions are just one type of definition.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated. So yes, when somebody, especially somebody who's made a career off of utilizing a particular word, then goes and complains about people using that word in different ways than the way that they use that word, to me that just reeks of like trying to control the narrative and being uncomfortable with the fact that other people might have different ideas.
It also reminds me of like this is a completely random example, but let's say like a chemist in Switzerland wins the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And let's say like 30 years later, another chemist in Brazil wins the prize, and it's for like a discovery that's the exact opposite of the first person. And then the first person is like, well, I mean, I can't believe that. That's just, I mean, this is not how I view this. This is how I view a lot of psychology, is like someone has an interesting idea, not correct, just interesting. And a lot of people think it's interesting, and then it like fades out of vogue, like we don't wear bell-bottom pants anymore. And then another person has an interesting idea, and it just goes and goes and goes, and a lot of them kind of repeat themselves. But I think that people who have the interesting idea, sometimes they get caught up in like, I am right, this is the way it's supposed to. And then you get all these older people in psychology being like, well, this isn't useful, or this isn't good, or this isn't what I really meant. And it's like a complete disregard for like how the world actually works. And it makes me angry.
Yeah.
What are your counters, Brandon?
No, I don't have a counter. The thing you're talking about is a thing that is very much happening in the field of psychology right now, including like highly placed academics attacking one another in the media over stuff like this. That there are kind of extreme examples of some people who are very much, the things we've discovered are accurate and correct, and because their careers built on it, and other particularly younger and newer people who are building their careers on no, everything that's come before is inaccurate and incorrect and whatever. To me, the whole thing is a little silly, but
I love the word utility, and like when I think about these things, is like,
yeah, useful.
Yeah,
That's what matters.
Yeah, there is a utility in this person's theory, and for me, subjectively, this is the utility. Period.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'll use the metaphor of these things are like tools a lot, because no one would argue that like a hammer is a correct tool and therefore all other kinds of tools are invalid. You know, like different tools are useful in different ways. So anything common has some utility to it.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise it wouldn't spread.
Mm-hmm.
But no matter how useful something is, it is also limited in its ability to be useful. I use tools a lot in these metaphors to explain this concept of like, it'll be like someone's handed a hammer and now they're nailing stuff in and they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is way better than what I was doing when I was trying to just push stuff in with my hands. Like I could do things I couldn't do before or whatever. And they're so excited. And then later on, they use that hammer to try and cut a piece of wood into two pieces. And they're like, oh no, this tool doesn't use it all. Like, what have I been doing this whole time? I was an idiot for ever thinking this was a good tool. And then they'll go to other people who are like, yeah, I love my hammer. I use it all the time. And they'll be like, no, you shouldn't. It's not a good tool. As though like they're just suited to different things. But yes, talking about concepts as though they exist is a big problem.
Yeah.
I don't mean whether they're accurate or useful or whatever. I mean, they don't exist. The subconscious is not a thing that exists. It is a concept, a word, a useful way to represent explain some observable things or represent some things that we think are happening. Executive functioning, codependence, like literally every word, addiction, trauma. Yeah. These are labels, these are tools that are useful. They are not actual things that exist in the world. Like,
the thing I kind of think of, like, as a way that like an image to remember this concept is that if my life is a timeline and it's like a long line, that there are like thousands of tools or whatever, and in any span of the timeline I'll be using certain tools and some will fade away and then others will come up and different combinations, or you might take one from earlier as sort of like in my subjective lifespan, this is what has been useful to me, but the things like fade, sometimes they come back, sometimes they never come back. Like it's just yeah. But I think a lot of people entering therapy, I don't know if they would put it this way, but it's some version of there's a story of my life, there's one story of my life, and I want you to tell me what that story is. And then when I finish therapy, I want to be able to walk away and say, I know the story of my life. I never have to explore this again. I figured it out.
yes.
I know why I'm like this.
Right.
Yeah.
That they'll say, here's this terrible thing that happens to me that I don't like, and I want to know why it happens.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is to change the thing. And knowing why it happens or coming up with theories about why it happens can be helpful in attempts to change it. But sometimes it's not either. And we certainly don't want it to be, as it often is, we certainly don't want it to be that now that we've explained why this thing is happening, it can't change. Because the explanation of why it's happening
So
is just
dangerous.
something that will happen.
Yeah.
I want to clarify too my use of language that, like, when I'm saying these things don't exist, I don't mean that there's no such thing as trauma.
Yeah.
I mean that trauma is a concept that represents some things that are observed. That there's nothing observable that we can definitively identify that's trauma, that's not trauma. These are opinion words. They're about something being, for example, a big way that people use the word trauma or traumatic is as though it is a description of the event, the thing that happened, that it was a traumatic event, the thing that happened was traumatic. When trauma is about the impact that something has on the body. Like when we use it in the medical sense of like blunt force trauma, no one thinks that blunt force trauma is describing the bat that was used to break a bone. We're talking about the damage that was done. So something being traumatic is purely and only, technically speaking, about the effect it has on a person. And that one's a big one, especially in neurodiversity. This idea of, as people will say, capital T versus lowercase t trauma, that we can identify what things are supposed to be traumatic or not traumatic. It doesn't matter. That's like saying, well, sure, your leg is broken, but you only fell from 2 feet. That shouldn't have broken your leg. That's on you.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Leg broken.
Well, and another way that could play out is like, you broke your leg falling 2 feet. You broke your leg falling 100 feet. So we're going to focus a lot on person B because they broke their broken leg is more valid. So we're going to put like thousands of dollars to try to help them. But person A who just 2 feet, like whatever, just change your habits.
Yeah.
Like, so.
I've been wondering, so a common thing among people who identify as neurodivergent is that they might have difficulty identifying a particular emotion or naming it. So maybe words like trauma can become a useful shorthand. So they're useful for a time until you can.
These words are useful.
Just to be clear, I think trauma is a very useful word.
Yeah.
If we weren't going to use the term trauma, we'd really want to come up with something else to represent the same. It's so useful to be able to talk about the way that something which happened in the past impacted your body in a way that it is still impacted, right? Like after you fall and break your leg, the next day your leg is still broken. And depending on the damage that's done to your body in a medical sense, like 40 years later, you could still have a bad knee because of something that happened. So it is incredibly useful to be able to say that, yes, this problematic or difficult thing first occurred when this whatever happened, this traumatic incident happened, and you can talk about it as a result of that. So it's not to take that away,
No.
Another way
To
I'll
stop people arguing about it. There's
Yeah.
no point in arguing about it.
Another way I think about it is like if I use the word trauma with a client and it helps a lot for a while and then maybe like progress kind of stalls out on using that word, that it's not about like that word isn't valid or it never existed or it was never right, that it had like a utility, and if the utility is like fading but it's still a word they want to use, like fine, but let's explore it from a different lens. Not that, does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's an opportunity to maybe drill down a little bit further.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
I focus on with clients is like how much is your life actually improving? Like observably. Yes, Brandon, what's your comment?
No, I think that's great. I just was going to use a metaphor to kind of encapsulate what
Yeah,
you're saying.
metaphor.
That just occurred to me as you were saying.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, because these things are sequential or developmental, right? Like there are things that when you're at step 1, you got to do step 2 before you get to step 3. And when you get to step 3, that doesn't mean that step 2 was inaccurate or unnecessary or incorrect. So the metaphor I was thinking was like, it's like someone's trying to get from Chicago to, I don't know, Salt Lake, because I know that drive. And you say, okay, first get on the 55. And you take that, and they get on the 55, and then, okay, now you got to get on the 8. Or let's use directions instead of roads. Then you say, like, okay, first you go south. And then they go south for a little while, and then you say, okay, now you go west. And it would be like reacting to that by saying, like, wait, so south doesn't get me there? I should have been going west this whole time? Like, no, you had to go south and then west. So when trauma or ADHD or whatever one of these concepts or labels helps you, and then you get to a point where you're seeing the limitations in it and you want to shift to something else that's more useful, that doesn't mean that it's wrong or that you're an idiot for having believed it. Or it just meant, okay, you got the utility that you could get out of that, and now it's time for something else.
And I think it's also
like the planning system that you mentioned at the start. It's worked up until now, and now it's time to try something different.
I also think it's okay to like stack the concepts too. So if it's something like from 18 to 22, I was viewing it as anxiety, and then from 22 to 28, I was viewing it as PTSD, and then from 28 to 32, I was viewing it as autism. It's not like you have to say like, I don't have anxiety, I don't have PTSD, I'm only autistic. And that whole 10 years of my life, I was just so dumb and wrong.
Yeah.
Also, we're coming up on time. This is...
We got 5 minutes.
Brandon.
Cool. Yeah. Utility. That's
No, you
that's what we're getting
start,
at.
you raise your tone of voice a little bit, you start talking faster, you lean in a little bit.
I feel like that usually happens after I feel like I tried to wrap up, and then another
that's
thing
true.
comes, and I'm like, oh shoot, now I got to do that.
Oh, that's such a good point. Okay, I've jumped the gun a little bit.
What matters, I say this to people all the time, I don't give, I'll modify my language for being on the
A
stream.
flying...
I don't care about accuracy. I care about utility.
Yeah.
There are things that can be accurate but aren't useful, and those don't matter to me. And if something is inaccurate but useful, cool. Theoretically, the fact that it's inaccurate could mean that it gets used in some other way which isn't useful later, or that there's some other more optimally useful thing that could be used instead. But it doesn't. I don't feel like I'm very good at getting this point across to people. I try so hard, and I don't think I get it across, that what you think and what exists are separate things. They're both important, they're both valid, but what a person thinks does not need to represent accurately reality in order for it to be valid or useful. It cannot replicate reality. Thoughts and reality, they're different. The internal subjective world and the external observable world are two different things, and they can't overlap. And a lot of this is just once people give up on that idea that there is a right way to think or whatever, then you can drop all the arguing and the animosity and whatever, and instead approach things for, okay, well, what is useful to take from any other perspective? Like the best development, learning, growth, change happens when you can embrace it When learning something new that you're like, oh, that's better than what I've been thinking, meaning what I've been thinking, as many people would interpret it, was wrong, and this is right. If you think of it that way, it tends to make you feel like, oh, I'm an idiot, which makes it harder to learn new things. It incentivizes you to reject new information, to not have to deal with the difficulty of being like, oh, I've been wrong all this time. But if you can let go of that and just approach new things and say, oh, that thing is more useful than what I had before, even though what I had before was useful. Or that thing is useful in this particular way that the thing I had before was not useful in. Then learning new things is enjoyable. And you're looking. And I do think that one of the things that's pretty universal about people who identify themselves as being neurodivergent is this belief that there is correct and incorrect ways to think, and like this belief that that you can somehow think the same as reality, that you can figure it out, understand it. Not only that, but that other people do or have, or that it's supposed to be easy. That there are elements of what we would call neurodivergence that are observable, like I struggle with this is more difficult for me, I'm well suited to that, etc. And there are elements of it, no, let me say that differently. If distress, as we talk about a lot, distress is the gap between what I perceive to be happening and what I think would be better to happen instead, right? The further between those two things, the more distressed I feel about the thing. That we're often, if not always, looking at the what is it that I'm doing thing, the reality. How do I shift what is happening to be more like what I think it should be or is supposed to be, whatever. And people tend not to look as much at the other side of like my ideas of what is the preferable thing. Is that even possible? Is that desirable? Is that useful? That shifting what it is you're aiming at. People think it's like you're aiming at a target with a clearly identified, this is the bullseye where you get the most points, and they keep missing off to the right. And so they're wanting to shift what they're doing to hit the target instead. When the reality is there is no target, and maybe where you're hitting off to the right, maybe that's where we should be aiming. And if you switch that, then all of a sudden the stress goes away, even though what's happening is the same.
Something I'll do with clients, I think this is what you're saying, just kind of my version of it, is to, what is the word, like to characterize it. So it might be something like, I don't know, I'm supposed to work 8 hours a day, and if I don't, I'm a loser. And then to be like, well, is that you talking, or is that like capitalism talking? And then being like, oh, that isn't like a thing. It isn't a thing or like, is that the patriarchy, or is that like, I don't know, white supremacy talking?
Yes.
So, and it's not, it's like a way to get to that. It's not like a end all be all, but it's a version of challenging the rightness of things.
Yeah. I mean, more broadly, yes, that's a great thing, especially with certain, you can see why there are certain people who, once they start to discover the utility of that piece of language, they're going to start seeing capitalism in a lot of things, or patriarchy in a lot of things. But that would fall more broadly under the category of just kind of asking people where they learned that thing, or where they got that idea, who first presented that concept to you, who gave you that message, where'd you pick it up, and labeling that as, like, if you want somebody to really hate something that they think, just point out that that's the message that was given to them by something that they already really hate. If you want somebody to really like something that they think, then point out that it's a message from something they really like. And you can...
Well, and adding a caveat, like, this is just kind of a... I know I'm using this phrase a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's just about the impact, the utility. Like, intent and impact are two different things. And yeah, people, when you become obsessed with the idea of right and wrong, good and bad, as I should say, again, those words like need are useful words. These are all useful words when they're used for what good and bad are opinion words. They describe the way that a person thinks about or interacts with a thing, not some intrinsic quality of the thing. which is why some people will like it. They're mind blown when it's like, wait, you said this thing was good to do in this context, and now you're saying it's bad to do. Because yes, it's not about the thing; it's about the impact that it has. Like the
Then you get
context
back
matters.
to useful utility.
Yeah, and
This was lovely. Thank you so much. I hate trying to get you
No,
to
that's all right.
stop
We'll
the
wrap up.
stream.
This is why I do try to bring this back to people by relating to the body a lot. And one of those metaphors I use a lot is these problems are like hunger. They are things that they start in response to something and they grow and they get worse. And then there are things you do that stop them, make them go away or diminish. And then they come back because that's what it means to be human. You just got to keep doing stuff.
The entropy of your mind and your body and the universe.
Right. As opposed to like homework where there's an answer to the problem and you answer it and it's done. Real life is not like that.
Well, and then a couple years later, you take like AP physics, and you're like, "Oh, that actually isn't true. It was just like a thing to
Honestly,
help me learn about this other."
Related, one of the things I thought about when you were talking about novelty
Yeah.
is how interesting something is to you is directly correlated, like 1-to-1 correlation with how close attention you pay to it. And people tend to think of that as causation, that because it's interesting, I'm paying close attention.
Yeah.
But as an experiment, anyone can do this right now as an activity. Literally take anything within reach of you and make yourself pay very close attention to it and notice how as you do that you notice more interesting things about it.
That helps me let go of judgments towards other people who might be very interested in something that I'm like, oh, that doesn't make sense. It's like, oh, they're just looking closely at it.
Yeah, it's true of humans and like the more you pay attention to something, the more interesting it is, and vice versa. So with novelty, you can, even without physically changing your environment, you can get novel things by just picking something in your environment and paying closer attention to it.
Yeah, when we were talking about it, I pictured walking towards that lamp and just like touching it. And being like, oh, what is this lamp? Like those mindfulness, what does it feel like? What does it smell like? Not just what does it look like?
That's one of the reasons that mindfulness is very helpful for people often.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Yeah.
You
wrapped up like 3 times. Well done. It's been lovely to see both.
Yes.
And watched. Thank you. And you can find out more about effective artistry at the website effectiveartistry.com.
I won't be here next week. I don't know if the two of you want to do the stream without me, but
I'll
we can talk
skip
about
it.
that off.
Most likely.
Okay. There probably won't be a stream next week,
Probably.
but we'll be back the week after.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's lovely, Marie. Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.